Hi everyone, in today's video I am going to be sharing how to create these felt cookies and the goldfish from a pattern that I have for free on my blog today. So you can go over to my blog, the link will be down in the description box below, and you can download and print this pattern right here, which gives you all the pieces that you need to create this fun felt food. Felt food is something I have made for a while. My daughter loves to play with it, or she did. She's getting a little older for it now. But I have all these patterns, so I thought I would start sharing them here and also tutorials to go along with them to help you see how to put everything together. So if you are a first-time hand sewer, it's not a big deal. These are really simple and easy stitches. I promise you can do it. So we're going to start off with the goldfish and bag. This is a longer video, so I'm going to let you know up front. There are going to be timestamps in the description box below, so you don't have to sit through every single piece of this, or you can start and stop as you wish, come back later, find your place where you need to. So let's go ahead and get started by making the bag. First, you are going to need 3 pieces of felt. You need white, you need yellow, and you need a little piece of orange. I'm also using stick strand embroidery floss, specifically DMC embroidery floss, in colors that match the felt. And then I'm also going to cut out these 3 pieces from the pattern. I like to just cut out the pieces I need and keep the other pieces attached to the paper until I'm ready to use them. Then as I use them, I just put them in a little baggie and keep them with my sewing stuff. Now in this pattern, you are going to see what each pattern piece is. It's going to give you the name, and it's also going to give you what colors you want to cut each one from. That is inside the pattern piece that you will cut out, so you will always have that with the piece. So this first piece is the goldfish bag, and it says we're going to cut 2 from white felt. Now, whenever I'm cutting 2 of something, I know I'm going to be stitching it together the majority of the time. So that means I like to cut them both together. Felt can be a little funky when you cut it. It can leave some weird marks. So it's better to have the weird marks on both pieces so you can stitch them together and make it look right. This way, I just have them together ready to go. So I fold my white felt in half, and then I just use straight pins to pin it down. Straight pins are very cheap, but they are an extra hand when you need it. So I just go ahead and pin the pattern to the felt and then use a pair of scissors to go ahead and cut around the pattern. Now, whenever you are cutting, you want to make sure that you are using very sharp scissors. Felt is not the easiest thing to cut. Like I said, it can get a little bit wonky, it can get a little bit funky. So use a nice pair of strong scissors, and also the spring-loaded scissors might be a good idea if you have hand problems. So I'm using regular scissors. I do have spring-loaded ones, but my kids kind of stole them during the last homeschool session and used them to cut a bunch of different things, so they're not as sharp. But I would definitely suggest those while you're cutting, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of these. So now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the orange wave piece. I took that piece of the pattern, pinned it to my piece of orange felt, and then I'm cutting around it. Very, very simple. And these patterns do have colors on them, but if you wanted to switch up the colors, you definitely could. This isn't, you have to do it this way. No, use your creativity. Just have fun with it. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut out the little goldfish that's going to swim on the wave. So I am pinning the goldfish to the piece of yellow felt. Now I will use this goldfish again later on to create the goldfish that will go in the bag. So I like to keep, like I said, all of my pattern pieces as I use them. I just put them in a little baggie together so I know what set goes with what set. Now, as I'm cutting this out, I will mention something about my freebies over on my blog. You can use them however you want. If you want to make stuff to sell with them, great. If you want to sell these, great, do it. The only thing that I ask you don't do is try to pass them off as your own, and don't try to sell the pattern itself. It's for free over on my blog, so give people the link. Basically, just be kind and decent. That's all I ask. Now, we are going to go ahead and start stitching on the pieces to the front of the bag. I like to do all my stitching on the front of pieces before I sew anything together. That way I can hide the stitching behind. Now I've went ahead and pinned down some of the pieces. I'm starting with the orange, and like I said, I am using 6-strand embroidery floss. This is the DMC. I find it really doesn't get tangled near as much. Still a little bit it does, but it's manageable. So I like to use 3 strands of the 6-strand. That means I just take out 3 strands, and then using my fingernail, I just kind of separate the other 3 strands by dragging it down itself. You can see better in the video how I'm doing that here. You do need to be a little bit careful as you separate this out. It does have a tendency to get tangled up if you don't do it in sections, so just take your time and separate it. It will come apart, I promise. Like I said, I use 3 strands, but I'm only using my felt food for 1 kiddo. If you're using it for a classroom setting or a daycare setting, or more than 1 kid, you might want to maybe use 4 strands, maybe even 6 if you wanted to, but I find 3 holds up pretty well. Now to get ready to sew, I like to go ahead and thread my needle. I'm using a smaller needle here. I don't want to create too big of holes. The bigger the hole, the less integrity your felt is going to have on the edges. Then I create a little knot at the end of my thread. I do a double knot so it will stay put, and then it's time to start sewing. I like to start off in between layers. So I have my orange wave pinned to my white piece of felt. I am not going to start stitching behind the white felt. I'm going to start in between the white and the orange. That's going to hide my little tail really, really well. So that's something I like to do. If you are a new sewer, you don't have to do that. You can just start on the back. I just like to hide as much as possible. Now I'm going to do a whip stitch. This is just going to tack on the orange piece to the white felt. So on the bottom of the wave and the top of the wave, where I'm not at an edge, I will be using a whip stitch. All that is going up through the back and coming down through the top, and you're just tacking on those edges. So I come up about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of the orange felt. I bring my needle straight through the back, and I'm going to pull all my thread through as I come up. You want to make sure that you completely pull your thread through as you are doing your hand sewing. If you don't, it's going to get stuck. Also, make sure as you go through that you don't have any tangles. I will show you in the video in just a minute how to release your knots if you get them. Once you have come up about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of the orange, you're going to insert your needle right where the orange and white meet. Not through the orange, right underneath it where it meets the white felt. And you're going to pull back down through the white felt. This is going to create just the tiniest little stitch, and it's going to keep that orange right onto that white. Now I'm going to speed this up a little bit just so we're not here all day watching me do some whip stitches to secure this down. But if you have any questions about the different stitches and you would like to see a video specifically on the different stitches, let me know down in the comments below and I can do that too. Also, because this is such a long video, I don't normally do this, but in some portions I will just be overlaying music as I do the stitches. I did not want to cut any of this out so you could see the entire process, but I don't want to talk for 1.5 hours either. So music it is. Now this piece in the pattern does have 2 different stitches, which isn't really normal for the pattern. Most of the other pieces are quite a bit easier. But for this one, because it has that edge that doesn't meet another edge, and then it has an edge, 2 edges that line up together, we're going to do 2 different stitches. Once I get to this edge, I am going to start a blanket stitch to secure the 2 edges together. You could continue doing a whip stitch if you want. That's perfectly fine. I just like the look of a blanket stitch. Blanket stitches are very easy. All you do is come over about 1/8 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. So 1/8 of an inch from your first stitch and 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And then you're going to start to pull through to the back. But once you get a little loop, you're going to insert your needle and pull the thread through that loop. This is just going to make a little secure edge along the edge with your thread. A really cute stitch to use for felt food, and it's really secure. So again, pull through to the back, and then as you come up, you're going to create that little loop and just insert your needle right through there. That is going to make that nice little secure edge. This is a lot easier to see. I am not great at explaining, but I can show you. So be sure to watch the video. You can slow it down, you can rewind it, whatever you need to do. So I will just continue that blanket stitch until I get to that top corner. And then once I get around to the other edge, I'm going to go ahead and start whip stitching again. And then I'll get to the next edge and I'll do the blanket stitch. And then I'll get to the bottom edge and I'll finish whip stitching. Like I said, this is the way I do it. However, if you just want to do the whip stitch, do the whip stitch. If you just want to do the blanket stitch the whole way around, you can do that. It does get a little tricky though with those edges that don't meet up. So just keep that in mind. But it's whatever you feel like doing. Inevitably, while you are creating your felt food and doing any hand sewing, you're gonna get tangles, you're gonna get knots. Let me show you the easiest way that I have found to get out those knots. So I ran into a little bit of an issue here. What I like to do is take my needle that I'm working with and insert it right into the knot that I've created. Then I just give it a little wiggle and it just kind of releases itself. If it's a little bit more tangled than what this was here, you might have to do a few more shakes or insert it into a different point. But I promise that technique has worked for me every time. Now, I am to the back and I am done. What I need to do now is tie off my thread. All I'm going to do is insert it a few times back and forth through just the white felt. I'm not even going all the way through the white felt. So this thread is essentially going through the middle fibers of the white felt. This is going to keep that thread really secure. It's not going to go anywhere. But I will show you what I do to tie it off as well, just to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere the extra mile. So once I've gone back and forth about 3 times, I'm going to go ahead and find a stitch and pull my thread through it. Then I will just loop through that little loop I've created, stick my thread right through it a couple of times, and this is going to create a little knot. I'll pull it nice and tight, and then I can trim off that edge really close to that knot, and the thread's not going to go anywhere. First of all, if your knot comes out, you still have the secureness of going back and forth through the thread, so you're like double locking it. That's the way I tie off all of my thread, especially on the back of pieces. Once I get to an edge, I will show you again how I tie off on those edges. Now it's time to tack on that little goldfish to the top of the wave. I am switching up my thread color to yellow. Again, I'm using those 3 pieces out of the 6 strand. I'm not using the whole 6 strand. I'm creating a knot on the end of my thread just to make sure that everything stays put as I am sewing. Then I am starting my thread at the back of the yellow. I'm not going through the white yet. I'm just going through that yellow. That means that little piece is going to be hidden, and I can start doing the whip stitch to tack this on. Now, because I am not hitting any edges here, I'm going to go ahead and do a whip stitch around the entire goldfish. This is super simple. All it does is take a little bit of time. Now here you're going to hit a few curves and things. As I'm whip stitching, I'm just going to follow those curves. It's really simple. And because we are using the same color thread as we are felt, the stitches, even if you mess up a little bit, they're not going to show near as much. That is why I love to use the same color thread as I do felt. You could by all means just buy like white, really thick cotton thread and use that, which I have done before when I first started making the felt food. But I have found that I really like the look when I use the same color of thread as the felt, and it hides my mistakes a lot better. And you would think buying just one color of really thick, nice thread would be cheaper. It's actually not. Thick thread is expensive. The DMC floss only costs about 40 cents a piece, 40 cents a skein. And I do not use a whole skein between maybe 3 patterns. I mean, it takes a lot for me to go through a skein of yarn or a skein of DMC floss. And the fastest one I go through is probably the tan, the cream, and the white. But the colors, I have skeins that I've had for years. So just keep that in mind as you go to buy supplies for this. Once I've made it completely around the goldfish, I'm going to tie off just like I did before. I'm inserting my needle back and forth just through the middle of the white felt, not even going all the way through the white felt, just back and forth about 3 times. Then once I've done that, I will find a stitch and just loop my thread through it. So right underneath that stitch, and create a little loop. Once I've got the loop, I will insert my needle through it a couple of times and pull that thread tight to create my knot and snip off really close to that knot. That is going to keep my thread secure even as my kiddo plays with it. Now we're going to finish up this bag. It's time to stitch the front that we have been sewing on and the back together. You could add some decoration to the back if you want. I'm going to keep it nice and plain and just keep my stitching to the front. I'm going to secure the two pieces together with my straight pins. Like I said, those straight pins are just my extra set of hands for this project. I'm going to switch my thread to white, and I'm going to start stitching the two pieces together. Now on this, I will just be stitching 3 edges. I'm not stitching the top closed. I'm just stitching the right side, the bottom, and the left side. I'm starting on the top right hand corner, and I'm starting in between the 2 layers. Then I'm going to start my blanket stitch. So in order to do this, I'm going to go around to the back and come straight up through that hole I just made. Then that's going to create a little loop. That's going to be my starting loop. So I'll pull my thread just about all the way through until I've got a nice little loop. I'll insert my thread into that loop and pull through to create that nice little blanket, first blanket stitch. Now I'm going to go about 1/8 of an inch over to the right of that stitch and about 1/8 of an inch down from the edge. Then I will just make, again, another little loop, pull through, and there's my blanket stitch ready to go. Like I said, on this particular piece, I'm not stitching the top closed, so I'm just going from the top right corner to the top left hand corner, and I'll stitch all the way around the bag using that same blanket stitch. So I will go ahead and speed up the video as I work my way around the bag. Now I almost didn't have enough thread to make it all the way around. I hate starting and stopping new thread, so I try to make it work if I can. But once I got to the top left-hand corner, the side of the bag, I just went ahead and made a few loops to secure my bag. That is going to create that little knot at the top, and it will stay put. I snipped off the ends nice and close to the knot I made, and then it's ready to go. On this particular bag, I did not do any stitching on the top edges. Now on my first bag that I made that my daughter did play with, I did do a blanket stitch on the front and back. Didn't stitch them together, just did the blanket stitch along the edges. I don't think that's really necessary. Felt tends to stay together, so you can skip that step like I did here. All right, so we've made the bag. Now we've got to make the little goldfish to go in the bag. Now, like I said before, we are using that same piece of the pattern that we used to create the goldfish for the wave. Only this time, we're going to cut 2 at a time so we can stitch them together. So when I'm stitching 2 things together, I like to take my felt, fold it in half, and cut both pieces at the same time. In this instance, I am using the yellow felt, and just to make it easier on myself, I like to cut a more manageable piece out once I get the goldfish pinned down or whatever piece of the pattern I'm working on. That just makes it a little bit easier on me, so I'm not working with such a large piece of felt. Once I get that stitched down, it's just a matter of cutting it out. Now, when you're cutting squares or really simple shapes, it's not that big of a deal with your scissors. This is where you're going to notice a difference if you have a not sharp pair of scissors or you have a really good pair of scissors. Little intricate pieces like this is where those scissors are going to make a difference. When you are cutting felt, you want to make sure you are holding both pieces securely together. I pin mine, you don't have to do that, but make sure you're still holding them nice and tight as you're cutting, and just take your time. Go around those edges as best you can. Inevitably, you are going to have to do a little bit of trimming whenever you take that pattern off. Some of the edges get a little wonky. I just use my scissors to trim right around that. Now it's time to stitch these 2 things together. Like I said before, I'm going to be using a blanket stitch for the majority of this. So again, I start off in between the 2 layers of fabric for my first stitch to pull through, and then I just go around to the back side, pull through that first loop that I did, insert my needle to make that first blanket stitch, and then I just continue on. So I go about 1/8 of an inch over and 1/8 of an inch from the edge, make my little stitch, pull through the loop. Very simple to do. And with this, you do have edges. Again, just like with the whip stitch, we're just going to follow those edges as best we can. This is where that same color thread really comes in helpful as you do your stitching. It's going to hide all those little mistakes. If the thread doesn't kind of fit really tightly into a curve, it's just going to look like a piece of felt. It's not going to be that big of a deal. Now, you will see I started on one side of the fish's body. I haven't done the tail at all yet. And that is because for this piece, I'm going to add a little stuffing into it. But first, I need to go ahead and continue stitching until I reach the other side of that tail. I might go a little bit into the tail, but I will just continue stitching until I get to that point. I like to leave myself about a 1/2 inch opening when I am doing any stuffing. For my stuffing today, I am using the Polyfill Premium Polyester Fiberfill stuffing. I've had this bag for years, literally, and it looks like I haven't even made a dent into it. This stuff lasts forever, I tell ya. So I take just the littlest piece of this. You don't want it stuffed too full. And I'm using a chopstick to do my stuffing. So whenever you do your stuffing, especially with small pieces like this, use something like a chopstick, like a wooden crochet hook, something with a little tooth to it where the fiber can kind of hook onto it and be pushed down. I also like something with a little bit of a point on it, but nothing sharp that's going to go through my felt or tear it. So I just start pushing and pushing and pushing until I get it through. As you can see, I'm using a really small piece of fiber fill, but this is going to do a good job of filling that whole little fish. And as you're doing this, you might notice your last few stitches that you did start to loosen up a bit. That's okay. You can pull them tight as soon as you're done stuffing it in. So once I get that stuffed in, it's time to go ahead and close up the hole and keep all that fiber fill right in place. So once I've done all that and I've got all the little pieces in, I'll just go ahead and continue blanket stitching around the rest of the little goldfish. Now, if you're working on larger pieces or maybe even smaller pieces where the fiber fill there's those last few little scraggly pieces that don't want to go in, you can just continue to finish stitching, and then when you're done, use your scissors to snip off those last few little fibers that are hanging off the edges. It's not that big of a deal. Now, if you don't want to add any stuffing to your pieces, that's perfectly fine too. You can keep them flat, you can keep them nice and simple, and just go with it that way. I like to add the stuffing just because I think it makes them a little bit more puffy and it adds a little plushness to them. Now I'm getting close to the place where I need to tie off my thread here. When you're working on a piece like this, you don't have a back to go through. So what I like to do is go underneath my stitches. So you'll see here, I am going to start going back and forth underneath the stitches. Then once I get to where I've gone back and forth a few times, I'm going to create again a little loop, and it's almost like I'm creating a blanket stitch. So I will go over the top and back through the back and create a little loop just like a blanket stitch, and go through that loop a few times with my needle and then pull it really tight, and that's going to create my knot. Once I've created my knot, I can go ahead and snip off really close. That is going to make a nice little secure ending for my goldfish. Now, I'm only showing you one in this video. For my bag, I made 5, so that means I cut 10 pieces and sewed them together. But I feel 5 is just about right for the size of this bag. Now, I love the way these turned out. They are a lot of fun. If you wanted to take this a step further, you could go ahead and add another white piece to the back of the front of your bag. That's going to hide all your stitching inside. But because it's just my daughter, I am not making these to sell. I didn't bother with it. If you're making them to sell, that might be another option. In this picture, you can see this is where I was using all white thread. Again, you can see a lot of my mistakes, so just take that into consideration as you're choosing your supplies. Now moving on to the cookies. There is one cookie pattern in this entire pattern, but you can make 4 different types of cookies, or I made 4 different types. You could make more if you wanted to, with what is provided in the pattern. So we're going to start off with the M&M and the chocolate chip cookies. Now these are made exactly the same way. The only difference is on the M&M, you have different colors of little dots. On the chocolate chip, they're all brown. So do whichever you want, do them both, but I'm only going to show you one today. I'm going to show you the M&M since I do have to switch up threads in between each stitching. With the chocolate chip and the M&M, both of the little dots are freehand. The M&Ms I cut a little bit bigger. The chocolate chips I cut a little bit smaller. And with these, you only need little bitty scraps of felt. So keep that in mind as you choose your colors and you buy your felt. If you have little bitty scraps left over, that's going to be plenty to make both of these. So for both of these, I am just going to be cutting out the cookie base out of my pattern. I'm going to go ahead and leave the frosting until I'm ready for it. Like I said, I like to leave all my pieces attached until I'm ready to use them, and then I just pop them in a baggie for safekeeping. Now for my M&M cookie, I'm going to go ahead and start with some tan, some blue, red, green, and brown. I am also using matching floss, the embroidery floss, for each one of those pieces. If you are just making the chocolate chip cookie, all you're going to need is the tan and the brown. But let's go ahead and get started putting these together. So in the pattern, or on the pattern, I should say, in the top left-hand corner, you're going to notice some notes. Those are just some notes I have put into this pattern, tips and tricks, different things on how I created my pieces. One of them is that in the cookies, I used low loft batting. So with the fiber fill, you could definitely use that, but that's going to create some really puffy pieces. With the low loft batting, this is going to create some nice flat puffiness and some nice plushness, still keeping those cookies relatively flat. I'm using low loft batting and I'm using double layers of it. So I'm going to go ahead and just start putting these together, but I wanted to make mention of those notes in the top left-hand corner so you can look them over when you print off the pattern. I'm starting off with the tan base, and I'm going to go ahead and, just like with anything else that I'm cutting two of and sewing them together, folding over that felt, pinning the pieces to that, and cutting them both out at the same time to save myself a lot of headache later on down the road. For the batting, I am going to go ahead and pin on that cookie base layer to it. And first, I am going to cut around the pattern itself. But as you're stitching, and if you have two pieces the same, those edges are going to line up. And for the batting, we don't want that. We want it to be hidden. So once I go ahead and get it trimmed up around the pattern, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over to the back side and then start cutting about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch from the edges, just a complete circle around the entire pattern. Now I like to keep my stitches about 1/8 to 1/4 inch in from the edges, so this is going to bump up right next to my stitches. I'm not going to be going through a lot of the batting, and it's not going to hang out the edge of my pieces. Then it's time to start cutting those M&Ms or chocolate chips, whatever you're going to put on top. Like I said before, I just freehand them. There's not really a rhyme or reason, and to be honest, the smaller you get when you're working with patterns, the more difficult it is to cut. So if you can cut these freehand, do it. I didn't want to put this in the pattern because all this is going to do is frustrate you when all you need are some wonky circles. These do not need to be the same size. They do not need to be perfect circles. Just make them relatively the same size. They don't have to be exact, and just cut a little bit of a circle or an oval, whatever you think looks best. Like I said, I do my M&Ms a little bit larger. I do my chocolate chips a little bit smaller. You can mix and match as you want. Once I have them all cut out, it's time to start tacking them on to the front of the cookie. Now for each of these, I am using the same color floss as I have cut them out, so I will be switching up floss quite a bit. If you are doing the chocolate chip cookie and you're only doing little brown chocolate chips, you don't need to do any switching of your floss, so use a little bit of a longer piece than I'm using here. To tack all of these pieces on, I am just using a quick little whip stitch. It doesn't take very many stitches to get these on, and it's a fairly quick process. The longest part is just switching out your different threads as you put them on. But each time I do switch out my thread, I do make sure to tie off and secure down those pieces really well, like I've shown before, where I go back and forth a few times, and then I do my knot and cut really close to that knot to make sure everything stays in place. Because these are such small pieces and because you're not using a lot of floss, this is a great time to use up any little extra pieces you may have. So I like to keep all of my extra pieces if they're more than like, I'd say 6 inches and above, I keep and I just kind of roll up and stick in my floss organizer. And then I can use up those little pieces on little stitches like this. A great way to keep using up those little bits and they don't go to waste. Once I have finished doing all of my little stitches on the top and securing all those little M&Ms down, or chocolate chips, whichever you're doing, it's time to go ahead and secure the two pieces together. But before I do that, I need to make sure that I have my batting in place. So I'll stick that in between the two layers, and then I will use a straight pin to secure all of those layers together. Those straight pins are just my extra set of hands, so I don't have to try and control all those different layers at once. Then I will blanket stitch everything together. Now, just like before, I am going to start off in between the two layers and create my first blanket stitch by coming around to the back, creating a little loop and going through. This is a nice secure start. And as I am stitching, I am not going through the batting a whole lot. I am keeping it just to those two layers of felt. Now, you would think circles would be a little bit more difficult to stitch together, but I promise you these are the easiest to do. So all I do is follow the curve and continue to blanket stitch around the entire piece. just going to be very careful, jump over to my next line, make sure I'm not pulling too tight. If you do pull too tight, you're going to create some nice bunches in your fabric and you don't want that. So just keep the tension normal and keep your finger on it. That will help. And then I just start stitching down the next line. And I will continue to do the same exact stitch until I have completely covered all of my lines. Once I have my first 3 rows done, again, not switching thread, not tying off, I'm just going to jump over and start doing the same exact back stitch, making sure that I don't pull too tight on those first couple of stitches. If you do, that's going to bunch up your fabric. Just keep your finger on that back stitch so you don't pull too tight, and that should keep you from making any huge mistakes and bunching up that fabric. If you need to, lay your fabric down on your work surface and smooth it out as you go. Once I have finished back stitching all 6 of my lines, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over and tie this off on the back. Now you can see the back looks pretty much like a hot mess, but that's okay because it's going to be covered with our next part. We're going to put all 4 pieces together. So we have the top, we have our back of the cookie, and we have our 2 layers of batting in between. I have secured them with a straight pin, and I'm just going to blanket stitch around the entire cookie just like I did before, making sure to follow the curves. Very, very simple and easy to do this cookie. It's just back stitching and then blanket stitching everything together. I secured my edges or my ends of my thread just like I did on the other ones, back and forth a few times, and then I created my little knot and snipped very close to that knot so I don't have any fraying of my string. Then that is the cookie. It is done. Very, very simple and easy to do, but I love the way this one looks. You could create different patterns if you wanted. I just like the crisscross stitch for this one. I think it's really cute. So we've done all of our tan-based cookies. Now it's time to move on to our sugar cookie. Now this one is one where you have so many different variations. You can have a lot of fun with this one. And really, you could make a whole set of these, no two alike, and just have a little cookie shop if you wanted to. For this, I am using that same cookie base, but instead of tan, I am using the ivory. I will also be going ahead and using the frosting portion, the last part of this pattern, so I'll trim that out from my pattern too. Now, as you can see, it says cookie frosting, and it says cut from your color of choice. Use whatever color you want. Use whatever scrap you have on hand. It could be brown, it could be red, blue, whatever you want. I'm using this pretty coral. I used blue on my last one. Now it's time to go ahead and start trimming around those pieces of the pattern. Like I said, I'm using the coral for my frosting, so I will go ahead and secure that down with a straight pen and do some trimming. Now this is one of those pieces that doesn't have to be perfect. You could switch it up a few times if you wanted to and make it a little bit more wonky so no two pieces are alike. And for the base, just like before, I'm going to go ahead and fold in half since I'm securing two pieces together at the end, and I will cut both pieces out at the same time. For the base, I am using an ivory color, which is a little bit lighter than the tan color. As we are going through this video, I wanted to mention that you probably didn't see a whole lot of pieces of new felt being used. That is because before I move on to a new piece of felt, I'd like to use up all of the other pieces I have, and if it fits, I'll cut it out of it. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a new piece of felt each time you go to cut something. As you're cutting out your pieces, make sure you put them on the edge of the felt. Don't put them in the middle. Start from the edge and work your way across the felt. That's going to make your felt go even further. And just like before, I'm going to go ahead and cut about 1/4 of an inch around that batting so I have room for my stitching. Now we're going to move on to the fun part, which is decorating the frosting of the cookie. On my first piece, I used seed beads, but I want to give a little warning. I had one kiddo to watch. I was playing with her while we played with these things. She was older. She wasn't picking things apart and putting things in her mouth or ears or anything like that. Seed beads can be a choking hazard. I mean, my son put a pony bead up his nose when he was a little boy. So, I mean, kids will always do it if they can, is my point. So if you are making these to sell, if you're making them for a classroom or a daycare setting, maybe even just for your own kiddo, if they're going to be playing on their own or they're younger, stay away from the seed beads completely. They are fun, they add texture, but they're not worth it. What you can do is create some fun stitches. You can create the look of seed beads with just a French knot. They're very easy to do. What you do is start up and come through the back of the felt. Then once you have come up through the back of the felt, wrap your thread a few times, you can do 2 or 3, around your needle. Then you're going to put your needle back through the back of the felt, very close to where you came up through. That is going to create that French knot. If that's not your thing, if that's too advanced, just create these little lines by coming up and back down through the thread and create the look of sprinkles. You can even make it more fun by doing different colors of sprinkles on the top with different threads or using a variegated thread. There are a lot of different things you could do. I'll show you the French knot one more time. You come up through the back, you wrap your thread around the needle a couple of times, and then you stick the needle right back down through the felt close to where you came up. Not where you came up, but close to it. And then that's going to create that nice little knot on top. Again, you can do the sprinkles if you want. That is much easier and it looks just as cute. But those French knots do give a little bit of texture and it's more of a sensory thing. I kind of like the feeling of them, but you can also keep it nice and flat. This is going to create that nice texture or that nice decoration without the risk of it pulling off too. So maybe stay away from the seed beads. I really didn't think it through, but again, I was just making it for my daughter when I made them. Now, once you have finished decorating the top of your cookie however you want to, or you could leave it plain by all means, it's time to stitch it onto the top layer of the cookie. Just like before, we're going to be doing a whip stitch. I'm using the same color of thread as my icing color. I'm not using the same color as the cookie. This is going to hide those imperfections and just give me a little bit more wiggle room to make mistakes. So I came up through the two layers, not the two layers, excuse me, in between the two layers, and then I just started to whip stitch around the entire piece. Once the frosting is secured down and in place, it's time to go ahead and insert that batting in between the two layers. For this, I really like to use those two layers of batting. It makes the cookie more fluffy and more realistic because in real life, sugar cookies are a little bit more fluffy. Then I go ahead and straight pin everything together so it stays put, and I will use a blanket stitch again around the whole cookie to secure it together. To finish the cookie and to make sure everything stays nice and secure, I'm using the same technique that I did before, going back and forth under the stitches a few times, and then creating that little loop and my knot on top and cutting the thread close to that knot to make sure everything stays put. And that is the last cookie and the last piece of this pattern. I hope you all found this video helpful to kind of navigate yourself through that free pattern that is available on my blog. Don't forget that link is down in the description box below. These videos do take a long time to make, so if you enjoyed it, make sure you let me know down below in the comments and give this video a thumbs up so I know to keep making them. That is going to do it for me today. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, you can do that on the left here. And another video that you might want to watch is on the right as well. Don't forget all the information in the description box below either. Happy crafting, everyone.